All right, last time we finished with the main division within Islam, and of course we have these two main divisions of Islam, but there were further divisions that take place further down in the history. So just real briefly, I want to touch on a couple of those. Of course, first of all, we have Sunni Islam. Now, what signifies Sunni Islam is, first of all, the majority of Muslims are Sunnis. Not necessarily the majority of Muslims where you are in the United States, because of the war in Iraq. And because of even what went on in the car industry up in Detroit, the largest mosque, the mosque we think of in Dearborn, is actually a Shia mosque. And there are primarily a lot of Shias up in that area, but they are not representative as the largest. The largest are indeed the Sunni Muslim group. Sunni Muslims look at, I often compare Sunnis to Protestants, if you will, because there is no central leader in Sunni Islam. There is not one spokesman for Sunni Islam. What you do have in your book is an understanding that Sayyid Qutb, from 1906 to 1966, very much popularized and brought back a lot of religious texts and brought Sunni Muslims. Really, it's through Qutb that a lot of radicalness came back into Islam, especially within Sunni Islam, and a real emphasis back into a Quranic understanding of Islam. So he brought them back to a very conservative understanding of Islam. But one of the keys to Sunni Islam that is important is there's not one central religious leader. There's one central religious text, the Quran, but there's not one central religious leader. Besides Sunnis, then you have the Shias. Now, the Shias follow Ali, and Shia Islam is distinct in a lot of ways. Sunnis consider Shias to be a sect, as they do everything else, actually, but they are a sect, and if anything, they're a divergent sect. So because of that divergence and because of the fact that they have wandered from what they would consider to be the true Islam, there's a lot of Shia-Sunni violence. And Shia Islam is in some ways more like what we would consider Catholicism. They have centralized leaders, which are typically today in Iran, although they have some in eastern Iraq as well. These are the Ayatollahs. And they can speak on behalf of Shia Islam. And in fact, to a degree, to some point or another, they can speak on behalf of God. And so they are much more centralized than Sunnis are as far as their practices and some of the things that they believe. During the 18th century, under Muhammad ibn Abd al-Wahhab, there developed a Wahhabi presence of Sunni Islam. It was a revivalist movement devoted to missionary zeal and peace. And so with him, you start to see Wahhabism, which is the expansion of Islam. And it's almost a missionary, if you will, expansion, where you have missionaries, Muslim missionaries, going out into parts of Africa and around the world with a desire to convert people. Now, we often think of Islamic conversion as forced or coerced conversion, but actually in many parts of the world, what they do is they go in and they start businesses. They come with a lot of money. They build nice mosques. They give money to the poor. They help other people start businesses if they convert. So there is almost, if we use the term rice Christian, there is a rice Islam. And so if you go into parts of Africa, you'll find this form of Islam, which in name is Islamic, but in practice, we talked about implicit religion, in practice it's still very much African tribal religion, kind of like the Catholicism that you see in different parts of South America and the Caribbean. It's called Catholicism, but it's not practiced. And so you have the same thing with Islam. People who say that they're Muslims, but they still practice all of the things that they practiced before. So you have Wahhabism. Then we have Ismailis, which is a breakaway branch. and really as one of the most advanced forms of Islam, very much accommodated with the West. But the Ismailis, they're a branch off of Shia Islam. And so they are a group that, like for an example, in Syria, the dictator today of Syria is a branch, an offshoot of this form of Islam, which came from Shia Islam, which is why one of the problems in Syria is the fact that Iran strongly supports the leadership in Syria, even though the majority of the people are Sunnis. And so that's why you have such a vicious war between the dictator, Assad of Syria, and what was, or to some degree still is, ISIS and Al-Qaeda. There's this animosity between them because Assad is more of a Shia form, although he's Ismaili. He's more of a Shia form, thus the Shias support him, whereas the rest are Sunnis. You also have a small branch called the Druze, which branched off of the Ismailis. They are primarily in Lebanon and parts of Israel. They are a secret sect. They can actually, within their doctrinal understanding, if there are Jews or Christians in power, they can say that they are Jews or Christians. If there are Muslims in power, they say that there are Muslims. They're an extremely difficult people group to get involved with, and very, very unique. Their beliefs are hidden. They have extra holy books that they do not share with the outside world, and you have to be a Druze in order to understand those. The Kharijites, they rose from a schism during Uthman's time. They're a radical charismatic group, similar to fundamentalists, stressing puritanical morality and a literal reading of the Quran. So they tend towards that fundamentalist group and can be quite puritanical, and even radical. And then Sufism is a mystical revivalist group, functions both in Sunni and Shia Islam. We talked about it before in the fact that they are very charismatic, they are very spiritual, they very, if I can use the term, Pentecostal in their form. They might even speak in tongues, raise their hands when they worship, sing and dance and things like that. So it's a very mystical form where they fast, pray, meditate on key scripture, and emphasize a personal, even hypnotic state of their religion. Now, when we talk about their beliefs and practices, chapter 24 focuses in on that. Just a couple of things that I want to bring out. First of all, as we think about the Quran, of course, the Quran is a sacred book. It's at the right hand of God, given directly to Muhammad. It is not inspired as we think of inspired, because it is given word for word, and Muhammad was to write it down word for word as it was given to him, or he was to recite it word for word. And the Quran is the pure revelation of God. Now, what's important for you to understand is that the Quran, when you're dealing with Muslims, is in and of itself sacred. That's why you never write in a Quran, you never put a Quran under another book, you don't tear a Quran, and you sure don't burn a Quran, because it is sacred in and of itself. That means that we would look at it as saying it's almost godlike. It is not considered God, but it is almost godlike, has qualities as God. Thus, to burn it or to mistreat it is considered highly offensive by a Muslim. Now, within the Quran, we have something called the doctrine of abrogation. Now, the majority of Muslims believe in this doctrine. And what the doctrine of abrogation is is it says that later verses of the Quran can abrogate, take the place of earlier verses of the Quran. Now, of course, this creates a tension, right? Because if the Quran was written at all from the beginning of time and sits at the right hand of God, how can one verse that comes later abrogate a verse that comes before? Muslims don't ask that question. You don't ask questions of the Quran, but most Muslims will believe in abrogation. So for an example, and this is a negative example, probably not one that you would want to necessarily bring up right away in a discussion with your Muslim friend, but early, Muhammad had adopted a son. And so he had full adoption of a son. In one of the wars, he took a woman and he gave that woman to his son. The story is that she was a beautiful woman, that Muhammad liked her quite a bit. She was not doing well with his son, and so he wanted to take her as his wife. However, he could not take his son's wife as his wife. So he received a verse, a new verse, which abrogated a previous verse, which wiped out adoption. So in Islam today, there is no such thing as adoption. Wiping out adoption meant that his adopted son was no longer his adopted son, but just a follower and a friend. And so he was able to take that woman and make her his wife. So that's how abrogation worked. So that older verse takes the place of the newer verse. There are other verses like that, and we have to be careful. So when we think about using the Quran in evangelism, I think this is one of the places that we have to be really careful. A lot of times people will say, well, the Quran says that Muslims are to read the holy books of the Christians and the Jews. So they're to read the Torah, the Sabur, and the Injil. So that's the Old Testament, the books of the prophets and the Psalms, and then the New Testament. But all Muslims will tell you that those books have been corrupted. So a lot of times we say, hey, you should read this. But abrogation has done away with those verses because those books have become corrupted according to Islam. So it's not actually useful to use those Quranic verses in defense of reading the Bible. Instead, I think when people say that the Bible is corrupted, I'll do one of three things. First, I'll ask, when was the Bible corrupted? I'll ask, was the Bible corrupted before the time of Muhammad or after the time of Muhammad? If they say it was before the time of Muhammad, then I'll say, well, then why would the Quran have ever said that you should read those holy books if they were corrupted before the time of Muhammad? If they were corrupted after the time of Muhammad, I'll say, but there are exactly the same manuscripts that we can demonstrate before the time of Muhammad that are exactly like today's manuscripts. And of course, that creates consternation and confusion for your Muslim friend. The other thing I'll quite often ask is, is not God all-powerful? Is God not holy? Are these not considered scripture? Why would God not keep his scripture from being corrupted? And if these scriptures are corrupted, why could we not say that the Quran is also corrupted through the generations? And of course, they will absolutely say the Quran is not corrupt, but then that leads logically to an understanding that perhaps the Bible isn't corrupt as well. So it creates confusion, it creates questions in the mind of a Muslim, which is quite often what we're trying to do. We're trying to create questions in their minds and help them understand where truth is found. So the doctrine of abrogation. The third thing that your book talks about is the Muslim state. And this is the understanding that Islam is to take over, if you will, the world. Now, not necessarily by violence, but the belief is that one day Jesus will come back, that Jesus, when he comes back, he will promote Islam, and because he is a Muslim according to Islam, and he will convert the world to Islam. And so they are waiting that day. They're waiting the time that Jesus will come back. Of course, during that time, they are to be evangelistic. They are to have children. They are to take their rightful place as rulers. And So we need to understand that Islam is an evangelistic faith. It is not non-evangelistic, it is evangelistic. There have been many times when I've been witnessed to by a Muslim. Especially they have shared with my wife. In fact, it's interesting because more often than not, when she is with Muslims, when she has good friends, if she's getting ready to go somewhere, they'll often bring in an evangelist who will try and convert her to Islam, which of course she loves because then she can clearly state the gospel in those moments. So there is a desire for a Muslim state. Jihad is another question that we often think about and talk about. Jihad means struggle, spiritual struggle. It does not mean holy war as we often interpret it. Instead, it means spiritual struggle. Now, when 9/11 happened, the King of Morocco actually published a letter suggesting and reminding the followers of Islam, and this was Sunni Islam, that they were to participate in jihad, but jihad is a spiritual struggle against the forces of Satan in their lives. And he was not calling them to war, but he was calling them to a spiritual renewal and encouraging them to be better Muslims and to be more righteous. He actually promoted Sufism at that time, which was interesting, and suggested that more Muslims need to understand this spiritual aspect of what it means to be a Muslim. So the majority of Muslims, when you sit down and talk to them, if you talk to them about jihad, they'll say, no, we're not talking about conquering the world necessarily through physical battle, but we're talking about spiritual warfare, much like Christians talk about spiritual warfare, conquering the forces of the enemy in our world. And so they use it in that same sense. Now, that would be one branch of Islam. A second branch, a more radical, the more fundamentalist radical branch of Islam says that anything that opposes Islam is spiritually dark and spiritually evil and needs to be conquered. So this is one of the reasons that when you talk to a Muslim who understands, who has studied, they have a hard time condemning more of the radical fundamentalist Muslims who are committing jihad as we think about it in the battle sense, the killing sense, the warlike sense. This is why on paper you might see Sunni leaders condemning ISIS or Al-Qaeda, yet at the same time not condemning that, and usually condemning the aspect of war where they're killing other Muslims more than trying to take their place as the rulers of the world. Now again, this isn't something for us to fear. What I love about the fact that Islam can be evangelistic is that we can match that evangelism, even in their countries. So when I've been in restricted access nations and a Muslim begins to share with me and tries to convert me, then I can be equally forceful in what I have to say. And I can do that without fear because of the way that they are responding to me. So just thinking about those key terms, I think are important for us there in chapter 25 or chapter 24. The next thing we're going to talk about is some aspects of Muslim piety, and so we'll do that in our next lecture.